So there are three big reasons why all jiu-jitsu students should start building their game. Number one is that it's going to help you kill any of your plateaus that you're having currently and ones that you'll foresee into the future. Speaking from someone who's been training jiu-jitsu now for over 16 years, plateaus don't happen just one time at a point in your career. You'll experience them multiple times. The second big thing that having a game does is it always gives you some type of direction for your jujitsu. Now, I like to say that this is like developing an internal compass. So you have a purpose, you have a rhyme and a reason for what you're doing in jujitsu. You have an identity as a grappler. So if you always have a game, your goal is to continuously work toward improving that game. Third big thing is that it gives you something trackable and actual tangible to be able to see. We don't really have many things like that in jujitsu outside of our belt rank or standing on the stage on whenever we win a competition or a tournament or a medal that we have received. But if you're not really a big competitor, you don't do that a bunch, you don't care about the belt ranks, then having a game developed and being able to track it and see it evolve as you get better in jujitsu is one of the best things to keep us motivated and to actually help us accelerate our own jujitsu journey. In this video, I'm going to go over how I teach students to build their very own jujitsu game. You can adopt this very simple framework that has worked for hundreds of students that I've coached remotely and in person. So stick around. We're going to get into it right now. If you're new to the channel, my name is Chasen Hill. I'm a jiu-jitsu black belt who's been teaching and training now for over 16 years. So if you guys like all things jiu-jitsu, this is probably a pretty good channel for you to subscribe to. So make sure you hit the subscribe button down below before we dive into everything. So speaking from my personal experience, building a game is not something that I even really looked at doing myself until I became a brown belt. And it was actually a conversation that I had with my coach at the time who said, "Hey, your defensive ideas are really good. You're really solid at defending. You're really squirmy, hard to submit, but you also need to have some go-to offensive techniques or a game plan that you can just impose if you absolutely had to." When he had said that to me, it had just kind of clicked. I knew a lot of things at that brown belt level, but I didn't have anything that was really a go-to or something that I felt solid in doing. One of the first things that we have to kind of change our mindset around when it comes to building a game is actually how students interpret the belt system. And we're going to use that as an example because this is commonly one of the first hurdles I have to overcome when I coach students to developing their own game. So we have this belt ranking system here that's pretty standard inside of most jiu-jitsu schools. We have white, blue, purple, brown, and black. The way that I see most students try to build their very own game or try to establish direction for their jiu-jitsu is they'll say something like, well, I'm a blue belt right now. What do I need to know to become a purple belt? Or they might even say something like, I'm a purple belt. What do I need to know to become a black belt? Or what's the fastest way to become a black belt? Not that this mindset can't be somewhat helpful, but to me, this highlights the idea of what's called the outcome and not really the process of getting good at jujitsu. So this is implying that there are certain things that you can't start working on until you're a blue belt or until you're a purple belt, or if you learn these fine set of things, that belt's going to instantly come. And if you've trained jujitsu long enough, you know that's not absolutely true. There's a lot of skill development that has to happen. When we talk about looking into the future, I'm not as big of a fan for building a game. Now, what the belt rank system does do is an acknowledgement of how far we have come, a benchmark saying, hey, you've probably been training for this amount of time and you've learned this amount of things. And that's really all it signals to me as a coach. That's where I actually start with students. For example, if we have a student who's been training as a blue belt here, for an example, maybe they've been training for like 1 to 3 years, or maybe they're a purple belt and they've been training, 3 to 6 years. What I like to start doing with them to build their game is instead of looking into the future, we're going to cross that out. We want to take what they have learned up to this point and we want to start to assess it, right? Because there is a game that you have already fundamentally started to develop throughout your course of your time in jiu-jitsu. Unless you have been training for less than 6 months, even someone brand new theoretically has a game, then you are having a preference and a pattern and a style of grappling that's already developed. Now, it might be developing unconsciously. You may not be consciously selecting what you're doing. You might just be doing whatever your instructor shows you or the things that you feel the most familiar with. So instead of looking into the future, we want to say, okay, well, what do you already know? What do you already do well? Or AKA, what are some strengths that you have? And when we look at those strengths, that's how we can start formulating your very own game. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to be expert level or that you have achieved mastery, but you fundamentally probably do something really well. So we need to evaluate what you already know first before we begin diving down any rabbit holes and building any sort of games. So now that brings me into phase number one of what I coach students to doing and how they can begin this assessment process. And it's a framework that I call the GRITS framework. And so each one of these acronyms actually starts to stand for something. What you'll do is you'll learn this acronym and then you'll go and you can get out a sheet of paper and write down some things that you do well and some things that maybe you don't do well inside of this framework. And this gives you a really good foundation to start to find the different puzzle pieces that might fit together and build your actual game. Let's walk through all 5 of these GRITS components here that you can start building your game around. The first one stands for what we call your primary guard. And your primary guard just refers to the idea of your main guard that you funnel majority of your escapes toward. So if you're being mounted and you were to do an elbow escape, there is usually a common guard where students land on. They either land in half guard, or they try to get to close guard, or they try to get to some version of butterfly guard. But ultimately, there's like a default guard that they tend to go to and they tend to work toward. Next is what we have, what we call the root bottom game. And this root bottom game is as like it sounds. It's like your foundational home-based game from ideally your primary guard. So these would be your sweeps and your submissions and your go-to attacks that you feel the strongest using while ideally in your primary guard. So you can already see how this is developing into a little bit more of a cohesive strategy than just a bunch of random mixed bag techniques. If you're really liking this kind of information, make sure you guys grab your free guide that's listed down below. It goes more deeper into this grip system. It teaches you how to start building your own jiu-jitsu game in a very simple framework fashion. So make sure you grab it down below. Next stands for your invading guard pass. And so this is how you prefer to get around your opponent's guards or get around their legs. It's how you actually enter into the top game and the style of how you prefer to pass people's guards. Next is going to be your peak top game. And this is how you prefer to hold people down. Which type of top pins do you prefer? Side control, mount, back mount, and then ultimately, what type of submission are you really looking toward funneling throughout your time in that top position? And then last but not least of this grip system stands for our standing game. And so this is ultimately how you get the grappling exchange to the ground. Do you like to do takedowns? Do you like to do guard pulls? But how are you getting the ultimate exchange to the ground? So if you got out a sheet of paper right now and wrote out these 5 components and started listing out some strengths and weaknesses of each one, you can start to kind of see maybe where are some techniques, what are some moves, what are strategies that you tend to employ that you would like to build your game around. Now, when I start working with my students inside of my coaching program, I give them very detailed instructions on how to do this assessment on a lot more thorough of a basis that goes way outside the scope of this YouTube video. I even have them go and test it out in training for a couple rounds with some exercises because we really want to be sure that what we are putting out on paper is a good foundational start for everything else we're going to begin to build our game on top of. Earlier in the video, I said one of the biggest benefits to building your game is that it helps you kill your plateaus. So we're going to zoom in on what this does inside of phase two of usually how I coach students. Once ever they have their idea of some of their strengths and weaknesses for their game, now what they want to do is they want to start selecting things that they do at each one of these components. So what do they want their primary guard to be? What do they want their go-to sweeps and attacks being? Actually, about 7 out of 10, 8 times out of 10, the reason why most students are actually hitting a plateau is because they don't have any of these things actually pre-planned. They don't have any things that are actually strengths or anything that they feel confident going to. That was like me as a brown belt. I didn't really have a root bottom game or really even a peak top game. I just had good defenses and I knew a bunch of stuff, but I didn't really have anything in a go-to way. Some of the biggest benefits to doing this earlier in your career is it creates what we call thinking frameworks. And what thinking frameworks really help you do is they help you map out or plan the potential outcomes that are going to happen. So if you're in the bottom of the mount position, instead of thinking, man, I know 20 techniques I could do, these are the go-to techniques I'm going to use because they get me to my primary guard. And then once I'm in my primary guard, I'm going to try this sweep and that attack. Just to be clear, just because you have it written on paper doesn't mean it's going to be expert level or it's going to be always work on everybody, but at least you have pre-thought what you're going to do and you don't suffer from what we call the paralysis by analysis, where you have too many options. What we are talking about here is creating habits. Where most students get hung up is they are too reactive. What I mean by that is they're just saying, well, if I land in the guard, I'll react to whatever my opponent does and I'll choose that move. That sounds good in theory, but that takes actually a really, really long time to develop. Now, if you are out and you're training against people who are not as skilled as you and they don't know jujitsu, we can almost predict what those things are going to be. Where you start training jujitsu versus jujitsu, there is a lot more options that people can do and some things you may have never seen before. So we want to try to pre-plan what we're going to do at each of these scenarios. And in my opinion, this grips framework is one of the easiest ways to kind of boil down those 5 core components into that aspect. Now, what if you're a person that already has somewhat of a game? Well, what can kind of happen here is maybe you have like 3 out of the 5 actually somewhat good and somewhat developed. So maybe these ones are actually, good to go, but these ones over here are, not very good, let's say. So this can kind of tell you why you may be experiencing a plateau. Maybe you have 3 out of the 5 areas are more developed versus 2 of the areas are not as developed. Sometimes solving the reason why you're stuck might be slightly different, but in my experience, it has to do with one of these components is not very developed for a student yet. Sometimes it's all 5. They don't have anything in any one of them. They don't have a single one that they feel comfortable with. And for other students, it's like 1 is maybe missing or 2 are maybe missing. The other thing that could potentially happen, especially whenever we look into the future, is you might have all of these good to go at one time. Let's say, for example, maybe they're all good, but as you evolve in jujitsu, as you get older, as you begin to learn more, or your training partners get better, part of your game might have to evolve. Another area might have to change, or you might have to replace it. Let's say you do close guard as your primary guard. Well, as you get older, you might have to switch to more of a half guard. So there are several reasons why plateaus and stalling out can tend to happen. But once again, if we go back to building a fundamental game, we can use that as a way to troubleshoot and as a framework to be able to solve that problem a lot faster than if we didn't. If we just had a bunch of random techniques, and I'm not really sure what I need to be doing. Now, if you remember back to the beginning of the video, I also claimed that whenever you build a game, it gives you direction for your jujitsu in a continuous way. Whenever they start to build their game, whether they have all 5 components good to go, they feel confident in it, or they don't have any of them built, they're like, well, which one should I start to focus on first? Which of these grips components should I start building or giving some primary attention? There's a lot of different strategies that you could take. You could pick the weakest one, you could pick the strongest one. But in my general opinion, just for recommendation for the masses, is to focus building from the bottom up. Your primary guard is going to be kind of your home base or your go-to of everything. It's where the defenses start, right? It's the lowest bottom place that you can start to work from in the art of jiu-jitsu. And then next, we would want to try to figure out what is a root bottom game that I could enact from that primary guard. What are some sweeps or what are some attacks that I could do? That way, it helps me gain a more top position or become a little bit more offensive. And then third, I would recommend is focus on your invading guard pass, because as you get better at sweeping and attacking people, you're going to find more opportunities to begin to pass people's guard and play in that area of jujitsu. Fourth, I would recommend to focus on your peak top game, because you have to have a way to get on top and then control somebody, working on pins, working on transitions between the multiple different positions, and then what are the submissions you're going to try to funnel your game toward to try to move that and in the match successfully, right? So how can you keep control and dominate that top position? And then fifth, last but not least, is going to be your standing game. And I don't have this fifth because I think it's the least important. I think it's just the one that comes at the last in the tail end of jujitsu, because you need a plan for once the match or altercation hits the ground. But I'm a firm believer of training worst case scenarios first. So even when I start coaching students in a self-defense aspect, I want to get them comfortable on the ground in the worst place possible, because that way, if they wind up there, they're actually able to survive and they're able to escape and get out of those bad positions. And then we can start working on the standing thing to try to prevent that from happening. And then in a grappling context, you're going to go to the ground. The whole point of jujitsu grappling is to go to the ground. So we need a plan whenever it hits there. And so if we kind of map this out, we could say, okay, let's say I'm really good at takedowns. Well, if I'm good at takedowns, that's going to put me into the peak top position. And now I have a way to control and hold somebody. Sometimes when I take people down, I have to pass their guard first to get to that peak top control. And then from the standing position, maybe sometimes I have to actually pull guard. I can't take somebody down. So now I have a root bottom game that I can build off of and start to impose. And then worst case scenario, I get taken down and I'm absolutely terrible. So now I have my primary guard that I can work from. Some students might be really, really good at their primary guard, their peak top game, and their invading guard pass. So now I would recommend, okay, we'll focus on this root bottom game because all those other ones are developed. So let's focus on the root bottom game before we move on to standing. That's just some general logic that you could use. Do you have to follow it? Absolutely not. But that's just kind of my general recommendation of a direction plan and a way to kind of map out your training and what to prioritize here moving forward. A common question that I get asked by a lot of my students is, how many weeks, right? If I was to focus on this, how long should we focus on training each one of these components? My general recommendation is 2 weeks timeline. The reason why I decide that is because you don't want to focus on something, in my opinion, for 6 months. It kind of gets boring and it gets dull. And then we end up referring back to the things that we already do well. We need to create it just difficult enough and just enough of a challenge that we're up for it, but we don't want to set the goal of 6 months and kind of roll my eyes and be like, that's going to be way too difficult to try to accomplish. 2 weeks is a pretty good time period to set as a general goal. then you could reevaluate, you could reassess, see where you're at, and then move on to that next component if you wish to. So we've talked about now what it's like to kill plateaus. We've talked about how to develop direction with your game plan, but how is this actually tangible or it's trackable throughout your time in jujitsu? Well, hopefully, if you've gotten that sheet of paper that I told you to get out at the very beginning of the video, where I said to write down each component of the grits, write out some strengths and weaknesses. Well, whenever you decide when that is or whatever your game is, and as you develop, that is trackable and tangible. But how can we watch this evolve over the course of our jujitsu career? Well, if we go back to actually using the belt system here, let's say you started building your game at blue belt, and this is where you started, right? And we'll just take one example, and we're going to make our primary guard here. We're going to say it's, close guard just for this example. And you could do this with all of the other different components as well. Well, now if I have this tracked and marked as a blue belt, and then when I get to purple belt, right? Maybe this happens, a couple years later. Let's say, I was a blue belt for 3 years. So now 3 years later, I can say, okay, well, is my still primary guard now? Is it still going to be close guard? And maybe you have now learned more things. Maybe you've expanded your horizon. You've learned about half guard more. You've learned more about open guard. But let's say for this example, you're still like, nope, I spent all this time at blue belt developing close guard. So I'm going to keep that. So we're going to keep close guard as our primary guard here at purple belt. And then brown belt comes up, right? So now, we spend another 2 to 3 years at purple belt, and now we become brown belt 2 years later. Well, what's it like at this point? Maybe, you're a little bit older. You're not as spry and as young as you used to be. Maybe you've had a knee surgery, or you've lost a bunch of weight, or you gained a bunch of weight. There's a lot of factors that can make our game start to evolve here. And let's say for this example, you realize you're not as young, you're not as athletic. So now we have our new game is going to be half guard. Maybe you've really learned the intricacies between purple and brown belt of half guard. You've learned some techniques and you've now updated and modified. If you do decide to change your half guard, that's probably going to change your root bottom game. It's going to add new sweeps and it's going to add new potential offensive attacks. Maybe your peak top game doesn't change or your invading guard pass doesn't change, but if you kind of change one of these components, it does tend to have a trickle down effect moving forward. Let's say that you actually make it to black belt. So congratulations, another 2 years later, you're a black belt. And maybe at this time you've figured out that you like half butterfly, right? So you've learned more about this, you've developed it. And so now your game has actually evolved over time. But you could see the sooner that you guys start this process, we actually have it tangible and we actually have something that we can track and watch evolve over time. There's a lot of different logic to why we would want to change or update or modify. It could be because of your age, your size. The game of jujitsu has just evolved. Maybe you've realized certain nuances that you missed before. And this is where jujitsu becomes very magical and where I actually put a lot more emphasis on the black belt. You have learned to actually take something from being really crappy to really good. Your jujitsu was very influenced by your instructor and your early exposure. But then as you start to grow, you start to learn more, you start to add more pieces to it, you can literally watch it grow, you can watch it expand, and just know that that's totally okay to do. So many times students are kind of very narrowed focused and very tunnel focused in their jujitsu. We really covered the main components of why building a game is very, very important. It solves the plateau issue, it solves the direction issue, and it solves that trackable and making something tangible. Ultimately, you can start adopting this grips framework that I laid out for you guys or any other framework that you want to use. But if I encouraged you to start building your game today or taking a little bit deeper look at your jiu-jitsu, then this video did its job. If you're really wanting help implementing this information, I teach this on a much deeper level inside of my Jiu-Jitsu Accelerator coaching program. So I show you all the details behind this. It goes way more than just this 20, 30-minute video that's being shot here. We go through all the details and the nuances so you can really build your game. There's actually a whole 90-day transformation plan that if students follow it, they will be able to have their game very solidly built and developed within that 90-day timeline. So if you are interested in joining that, make sure you fill out your application down below. I'll see you in the next one.